Hello, everybody. Hello. Welcome. My name is Meredith Gershenson. I'm a research analyst here at workforce.com. And today we're going to talk a little bit about how to reduce no call and no shows. Today, I am joined by a very special guest, Dr. Brad Shuck. Brad, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, Meredith, this is amazing. Thank you so much for having me. I could not be more excited to talk about this topic today.
There's definitely going to be a lot to cover. That's for sure. Dr.
Absolutely.
Shuck is a tenured full professor and program director of the Ph.D. in Educational Leadership and Organizational Development program at the University of Louisville. He has worked with industry leaders in virtually every industry through the public and private sectors across 4 continents. Dr. Shuck's insights are widely applied in both the world's largest Fortune 500 and Fortune 50 companies, as well as those that are more small to medium organizations seeking to grow and empower employees. Awesome. Brad, I'm so excited to have you on. Thank you so much for coming. To give everyone a super quick rundown of our webinar platform here. On the right side, we do have the chat box. I would love for you guys to throw in a quick shout out as to where you're dialing in from. Personally, I'm coming in from Chicago, where it is actually pretty warm today, you guys. Spring is here, hopefully, and hopefully to stay. So I'd love to hear where everyone's coming in from. Feel free to get acquainted there. And if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please throw in those questions in said chat box where I see a lot of people are getting familiar. This is awesome. Oh my God, you guys are like coming in from all over the place. This is great. I can't even peg one down. We got Dallas, I just saw, another Chicago, and Megan, I see you. This is awesome. So feel free to throw in any questions you have in that chat box. I'll be sure to tag them, and we'll do a formal Q&A at the very end with Brad. And then we do have a couple poll questions throughout the webinar. Those will just slide on the bottom left of your screen. We love to engage with you guys. We love to see where your head's at. So feel free to interact with those. And then we do have a little handout, a little goodie bag for you guys, if you will. It's just going to be a nice little article to sum everything up, some of the data points we're talking about on the 5 tips to reduce employee no-call, no-shows. And if you are a member of SHRM or HRCI, we are offering some recertification credits at the very end. I'll be sure to shout those out. So again, be sure to stick around for that. And finally, to give a little background on workforce.com, we are HCM software that specializes for businesses with hourly staff. We run these webinar series to present our learnings and data from our own clients. Cool. Awesome. So to get things kicked off, first of all, it is really awesome to see everyone in the chat. This is so cool. Brad, I would love for you to tell me about your work as program director at University of Louisville of that educational leadership and organizational development program.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been at the University of Louisville now for just about 13 years. I did all of my grad work at Florida International University down in Miami, Florida. And while I was going to school, I was working full time. So, and working in a really large corporation, the hospitality industry. And so I understand some of the challenges that we face in real time around no call, no shows, around employee engagement, around culture. My research over the last decade has really focused on this idea of employee engagement and the intersection between workplace culture and health, mental health, physical health, and how does work contribute to things like flourishing? How does it contribute to things like sickness? And so we've just kind of dug into that over the last decade, and we do everything in a way that we just try to help people live better lives through their work, not just go to work every day.
Definitely. Yeah. And again, we were talking about this earlier, even before we hopped on. The aspect of COVID has really pushed this narrative of needing to solve the issue of absenteeism and no call, no show. And we're going to the differentiation a little bit later on. But first of all, I would love for you to tell me about some of the companies that you've worked with and the number one issue that they're coming across these days.
Yes, so we have worked in virtually every industry, from technology, hospitality, to manufacturing, to transportation, logistics, healthcare, incentives, travel. And here's what I think what people are really struggling with right now: retention, recruitment and retention, and then how do you grow that talent pipeline? Like, what does that look like? How do you do that when recruitment can be such a challenge at times? And how do you retain the people that you really need to move the mission forward, to move the purpose forward of the organization in a way that that grows that talent internally, not always coming external?
I love that. And, we'll talk way more about the aspect of getting ahead of it before things start to crumble a little bit. And I think that's such a good point that you raised. What are some of the trends that you're seeing within the hourly wage space for 2023?
Yeah, so there are really, I think, five that I would talk about, and I would call these currencies of work. So we talked about COVID being kind of a pivot point for a lot of organizations, and I think that's remained true even through 2023 and will be beyond. But we're seeing five real trends or currencies around the hourly workspace right now. The first one is stability. This is no surprise. There's a lot of instability everywhere. There's just a lot of noise. There's recessions, there's layoffs, there's political climates, there's all kinds of things that are happening in our lives that we're not perhaps a little bit more aware of now. And stability is about reclaiming a sense of stableness. So to the degree that your organization can do that for your staff, for your teams, for your leaders, I think it becomes really important. So stability is the first currency. The second is this idea of flexibility. And we'll talk about that later on. We talk about like scheduling softwares or using AI as a tool to help kind of manage replacements. But this is about how and when people work. And there is just this real need for flexibility right now. And this is about degrees of flexibility, not ultimate flexibility, right? Like sometimes there's just left and right limits, like there's guidelines. We got to follow within those guidelines. But to the degree that we can be flexible in how that work happens and how people have choice, I think it becomes a competitive advantage. The third currency is the idea of integration. And we're seeing this more and more now because when we were, if you remember back, 18, 24 months ago, life was kind of swirling around and there were all kinds of different things happening in our lives. This is the root. When we talk about quiet quitting, this is the root of quiet quitting, and it's not about doing the minimum. And I've been pretty vocal on LinkedIn about this, that we can't villainize this, right? This is rather about integration. So, for example, in my life today, I have a 12-year-old. She plays soccer. Like, I'm going to need to go to her soccer game today, or my wife's got a doctor's appointment, or I need to run this to school, or I need to get to the gym, whatever that may be. We're seeing employees integrate work and life in ways we haven't traditionally seen before. So integration is the third. Purpose is the fourth. I think this is the secret stuff, that when we can see a direct line of sight to how my work matters, right? So there's a sense of purpose in what I'm doing. Increasingly, that research is clear that work that doesn't have a purpose is not worth the cost. And people aren't going to just stay because. So to the degree that you can drive purpose, that direct line of sight, I think it impacts everything. And to the degree that you can point to that and show, like, here's how your work's making a difference, I think that really matters. And then the fifth currency is this idea of belonging. And this is true no matter where I'm at in the world, that everybody wants to belong, to be a part of something. And in our research over the last 3 years, there's a 2-to-1 benefit for employees who feel like they belong versus those who feel like they're very disconnected. And so it becomes really, really important that people feel a part of, that they can raise their hands in meetings, that people invite those voices in. This is directly connected to conversations we're having around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Belonging is a critical trend that I'm seeing in the hourly workforce moving forward through 2023 and 2024.
I love it. I mean, we were, again, talking about this earlier, where it seems to be this cycle concept of a snowball effect where everything impacts one or the other. And it's really hard, especially for those in the operations field, to convey that to those who are upper managers and more fiscally or financially focused, where the hard numbers are where things are measured. And it's really hard to measure an aspect of belonging or culture with hard numbers. So we'll get into a little more of that later.
Absolutely.
Yeah, first and foremost, I want to talk about, what you believe are the major difference between no call, no shows and absenteeism, because I think first and foremost, we need to define exactly what those are.
Yeah, so I love that. And I love that we're going to be really clear about like kind of what we're talking about. And when I think about, let's take absenteeism first. So when I think about absenteeism, it's when employees stay away from work. It's a part of the word. They're absent from work. And the idea of a no call, no show is when someone is scheduled for that work. They've agreed to the schedule, they've agreed to the shift, they've agreed to come in, and then they just don't show up for their scheduled shift. So the differences here are that absenteeism is when employees they're just absent from the space. But a no call, no show is when someone's agreed to do something and then they fail to show up for that shift.
Yeah, exactly.
It's problematic.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think in a way, absenteeism and no call, no shows are used a lot interchangeably. Absolutely. Internally within an organization, and to make sure that we're understanding that there's actually a really big difference here. And the no call, no show concept is way more frantic on the managers, where absenteeism, if somebody calls out, there's that tiny bit of leeway, even if it's very minimal, to actually go and find a replacement. Where somebody doesn't show up for their shift unannounced, it's way more on the manager, opposed to it being possibly on an employee's friend, whatever it is.
Yeah.
I would love for you to tell us about some of the biggest challenges HR and operations come across when they're dealing with no call, no shows.
Sure. Well, the first thing I'll say is that, to your point, like this wreaks havoc, right? The idea of a no call, no show is kind of a panic mode, because there is an expectation that we're fully staffed, like the shift is good. And it goes back to that sense of stability and that currency that I was talking about before, and how people see that sense of purpose within their work. I would say that the challenges really fall on 4 different levels. The first is the immediate situation, right? So I get somebody doesn't show up, we're probably 15 minutes into the shift and we're like, hey, where's Brad? What, like, was he supposed to be here? Like, what's going on? And so there's this immediate situation. And I would imagine that level of stress on that manager, that leader who's kind of taking care of that in the moment, like you start to get a little hot under the collar, like blood pressure starts to go up, or maybe this has happened a couple of times. And so as a result of that, like you've predicted that this might happen. And so maybe you're a little bit more controlled. But I think the first level is the immediate situation and like handling the immediate situation. The second is the impact on the team. And I think this is something that sometimes gets overlooked. When somebody no call, no shows on a team, that puts additional stress, workload capacity on everybody that's currently there right now. And it will impact their own sense of engagement, belonging, purpose, all the kinds of things that we were talking about earlier. And it just destabilizes the team. The third level is on the mission. When somebody no call, no shows, and this is a repeated problem over and over again, the ability to get the work done is diminished, significantly diminished. And so there's an impact on the organization's ability to fulfill the mission. Even if we're talking quick service restaurants, we're talking retail spaces, we're talking folks who are working directly with customers, the mission of that organization gets impacted. And then I think the fourth, and perhaps maybe most important, is the erosion of trust that happens with everybody who's within that cycle.
Sure.
So for those people who are in the immediate situation, the impact on the team, the impact on the mission, I mean, this is difficult to work. Like, I don't want to be here either. Look, I can't trust that this is going to work. And there's just this sense of erosion of trust that begins to happen. And that's a really, really dangerous position for teams to be in. When teams don't trust, when it's not predictable and it's chaotic, all kinds of problems can ensue.
Charmaine summed it up perfectly, saying both cause ripple effects on the rest of the team. Robert, thank you so much for your question. Also, I love to see your name in the chat. I will be sure to tag that question and we will get around to it at the Q&A section. And for everyone else, feel free to drop in those questions in the chat as well.
Totally.
What is the relationship between management and a high no-show rate? What does that tell you about a company?
It depends. And I think every company, in every geographical location has a story to tell. And certainly there are managers who are doing their absolute best, and there's just a high call out rate. There's just a high no-show rate with that. It doesn't necessarily tell me anything in the onset, but I do want to ask more questions, like what's going on? Like, how are you leading? How are you managing? What are the artifacts of communication here? How are we making sure that people know what their schedules are? How do we make sure that we're finding replacements? Like, what does that look like? Do people see that their work has a sense of meaning here, a deep sense of purpose? Is there a sense of belonging here? Are we able to be flexible? So I want to ask a lot more questions, but there is kind of a dotted line between a leader's response, a manager's response in the moment, that immediate kind of crisis situation, and then perhaps future no call, no shows, or high call out rates. There's no doubt there's a dotted line between there, and there's a story to tell. I think it's really important to talk to people about that story.
And what, in terms of the impact on labor costs, for those who are working on the COO side of things, what's the price of no call, no shows?
So this number is going to seem ridiculous, all right? But I want you to come with me, and I want, if you're listening in today, I want you to think about those times when you've encountered this. I mean, I certainly have. I have been leading a team. I've been faced with no call, no shows before, and the impact that it's had on me and my team has been enormous. But according to the CDC, the labor cost on no call, no shows is around $225 billion a year in lost productivity. That's a ridiculously high number.
And so
let's say we just impact that number 10%. Like, think of the billions of dollars that we could save. And SHRM would estimate that is a loss of around 37% of lost productivity every single year. So again, if we move the needle just a tiny bit on this, we could have a massive, massive return on investment.
I want to point to this first slide that we have here, and it's from the SHRM article, and I'm happy to send it over to whoever's interested. It's titled Total Financial Impact of Employee Absences in the U.S., and we are talking on the direct and indirect costs, specifically as a percentage of payroll, as we can see. And you mentioned that almost 40% productivity loss. And that is a huge, huge chunk of it. And I think it's interesting on the left side to look at that breakdown. We're talking overtime and replacement costs, total PTO. And I think going back to that dichotomy between HR and operations, we're seeing maybe more so the direct costs being associated with, okay, here's what the GMs are worried about. Here's what our middle managers are worried about. Here are those labor costs that we're talking about. But what aren't necessarily taken into consideration is that loss of productivity, coworker productivity, AKA culture cost, supervisor productivity, all that good stuff. So I think it's so important to, make sure that we're fine tuning it into both indirect and direct costs.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's just, again, like, this slide underscores the importance of talking about this, having a plan, and the potential impact we can have as managers and leaders by tackling this particular challenge.
Sure. I think it's interesting. I was reading an article recently on, how our population in the States is actually aging out. If you look at the, I think it's called like the demographic pyramid or whatever, where you see the ages and how it's narrowing down at the bottom and, bottoming up. In regards to our aging population, what have you found in terms of no-shows in the workplace between a younger workforce versus an older workforce?
Yeah, so this is a tricky question, right? There's lots of conversations right now around multi-generations in the workforce today. And I think it's an important topic for us to think about and talk about. There's a great author. Her name is Lindsay Pollack. She's a real expert in this area. I would encourage you to take a look. She just wrote a book called Remix. It's outstanding if you have questions about that. Here's what I think when it comes to like older versus younger folks in the workforce
Mhm.
is it really comes down to a sense of priority in some areas and how we are integrating generations into our workforce. I think that becomes a really important component of this conversations. I think when we think about a younger workforce, so I'm thinking about, when my daughter's 18, 19 years old, I think about the different priorities that she might have in her life at that moment and what may be going on and the different kinds of things that she's thinking about.
Mm.
And then I juxtapose that against like myself, right? And I wouldn't consider myself an older part of the workforce, but maybe I am. I'm certainly older than my daughter. And my priorities are a little bit different. I'm looking, perhaps my daughter is looking for excitement, social impact. She's got different priorities around friends and school and things like that. Whereas for me, like I got to pay my bills. And
Right.
so that impacts my no call, no show, probably. I've got different sets of priorities. And so I think it's important to really know your workforce.
Mhm.
And I do think it's important. And I think many of you would agree with me. I think it's important to not make generational assumptions about a younger workforce versus an older workforce because we can pigeonhole folks into stereotypes that actually don't play themselves out in work at all. But I think this really is about priority differentiation, understanding your workforce, getting to know your workforce really
Mhm.
well so that you can make adjustments on the fly as you need to.
To go off of that, what's a good way to get to know your workforce? How can somebody vet their workforce and then use that knowledge to approach the situation and address, the two separate cohorts, let's say?
Yeah, so I think it's about communicating, right?
Mhm.
And I think it's about all the different ways in which we communicate and how we use sometimes how we use downtime, how we use slow time, how we work together and we collaborate on teams. I think that becomes really important. When I work with an organization, I want to know like what are the artifacts of communication? Like how do people know what they need to know, like how do we communicate policies, how do we communicate procedures, what's the informal communication channels that people sometimes use, not always the formal communication channels. And I want to know like what are those artifacts, like how do people know they belong, how do they know what their shift is, how do we communicate schedules, do we use a software for that, do we use a replacement AI software for that, like what does that look like.
Mhm.
And so getting to know your workforce, this sense of sitting down and talking. And look, that sounds pedestrian. Like if you're on the webinar day and you're like, I'm looking for the magic bullet, and I'm saying, look, and just sometimes you just got to talk to people.
Right.
Like it feels really simple, but I would imagine when we're intentional about that piece of it, it could potentially change a lot and have a very transformative impact on your workforce. Just talking to folks. How you doing? What's going on? Hey, can I help you with anything? Do you need anything? How's the schedule working out? Is there any issues? Is there anything I can help you with?
Mhm.
I love to ask that question. Is there anything that I can do for you to help you do your job better? You'd be surprised what people might say.
Definitely. And you talk a little bit about how technology comes into play, and that's exactly what we do here in terms of like the software behind scheduling and time and attendance. It's taking managers' time and using it more productively so they can go back to the basics of communication, connect back with their workforce, and have that time of building, those indirect cost measures to make sure that those that aren't, having their needs met and, not being engaged as much as the next employee are, and it's again, it's a snowball effect. And once you can find that time, once you can put some of that onto technology side of thing, like workforce or, a similar software, then perfect. Yeah, I think that's such a good point. And I would love to turn our attention to this poll question I had sent out. And the majority of your workforce, is your majority of your workforce under the age of 35? If so, have you seen an uptick in no call, no shows since the pandemic? And it's interesting, a lot of people are saying yes and yes. There's a good amount of people who are saying actually no. People are 35 and up, or they haven't seen, an uptick. And it's interesting because as I was reading that article on the aging population, it's actually shown that prior to the pandemic, those who would have no call, no shows showing up would be over the age of 35. But that's actually flipped. Now we're seeing people who are younger than 35 actually having less no-call, no-shows, and those who are over 35 having more. So I think for this need of work-life balance principles being implemented, I think for this need of, wanting to have a family and being able to cater to them, those who are over 35 are typically in the healthcare industry. Having burnout is a whole nother topic we could get into in mental health issues. So it's very interesting, again.
Yeah, and I'll point out one thing. Stephanie mentioned that you don't just talk, but you actually have to listen. And I think she makes a really good point there. That it isn't just about it's not about the lip service piece of it, right? Like I'm just talking at you,
right?
But rather I'm talking with you and I'm listening. And I think that's a really, really important point that she makes.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting, for those who are in HR and are communicating with their frontline staff or even managers, to drop in the chat, what are some practices you do to show to your employees that you are listening, whether it's sharing a gift card with them, if they're talking about their favorite drink at Starbucks, whatever it is, I'd love for you guys to share some insights there. I want to go into policy creation around no-call, no-shows. So, Brad, my question for you is, what level is appropriate for managers to expect no-call, no-shows versus when they should intervene?
Yeah, well, hopefully we never get to a place where there's an expectation of no-call, no-shows. We know that that's something that many of us are going to deal with, or we're going to have to work through. For me, the appropriate level is the first time it happens, because we need to be really clear about the expectations, and I think that's really, really important. That there's a sense of level setting around expectations. Here's what I find, that a lot of people don't know what's expected of them. And it's assumed that this information gets picked up someplace. So if there is an expectation around no-call, no-show, I would encourage folks to be really, really clear in communicating what that expectation is. But I would absolutely intervene the very first time it happens. And I would want to know what happened. What happened? And all right, how do we prevent this in the future? When we talk about policy creations, I think it's important for us to create a very fair and equitable policy around no-call, no-show. For example, employees made no-call, no-show for a variety of reasons. One of the clients that we worked with recently had some transportation issues. Their workforce geographically lived really far away from where they needed to get to work. And if the bus lines were down, they couldn't get to work, and there was nothing that they could do about it. So they're maybe waiting at the bus stop, but the bus never came. And so hearing that is an important piece of intervening on the very first time. Maybe we need to do something about that, or there's an alternative. We could help somebody brainstorm alternative ways to get to work or to get into the office, whatever that may be. But yeah, I think I would intervene the very first time, because here's what happens if you don't. If you don't step in the very first time it happens, what you're telling someone is that it's okay. It's not really a big deal here. And so that very first time becomes really, really important. And it's not punitive, but it is about having a conversation. It's about talking with and then listening.
I think that's a great point. Carrie mentioned if bus lines are down, they could still call. And I think if they don't, that's a conversation that you would have with them. And that's totally fine. It happens. But make sure you pick up the phone or give us a text or an email, just letting us know, hey, this is what's happening here.
And maybe even, and I agree, I mean, they totally could call, right? Absolutely. When I'm having that conversation, I'm also letting them know the impact that had on the team. Hey, as a result of you not being able to be here, and we're not knowing about it, Stephanie had to stay longer, or Carrie had to stay, for a double shift, and that was really hard on her and her family. And so here's why we need to reduce this down. And so showing the impact of that, the cascading ripple effect of that, I think can be really, really important.
So that leads me perfectly into my next question. What sort of mistakes are you seeing when it comes to policy creation around no-call, no-show?
Well, the first mistake that I'm seeing is that they don't follow the policy or the procedure. And if you have one, it's really, really important to make sure that you're following the procedure and the policy, whatever that may look like. And every organization is going to have a different moving target on at what level does this become extreme. At what level do we take this into termination? At what level do we need to intervene? And I would encourage you, if you haven't yet had those conversations with your HR team, with your ops team, that you would do that. But the first big mistake I see is just not following procedure at all and going outside of those bounds. The second is failing to communicate clear expectations. So if we're not communicating the expectations, it's really hard to enforce an expectation. And it's frustrating on both sides because I don't know what's expected of me. You think I know what's expected of me. You're frustrated with me and I'm frustrated at you and we don't know why. And so there's this kind of dysfunctional cycle that gets created there. So not following procedure, not communicating expectations clearly. The third mistake I see is sometimes I see managers take it really personally, and this isn't a personal issue. It is a work related issue, and so what I see when people take that on personally is they get angry or they get kind of upset.
Sure.
And I think that could be problematic later on. So I would encourage managers to really practice sense of such self and situational awareness around that. The fourth is, and I don't see this very often, but I am seeing it more and more, is managers taking this out on their team. So as I'm not taking it personally, but I am going to take it out on the rest of you guys. And that creates a really, really dysfunctional culture. That is likely to increase your no-call, no-shows, not reduce them. So procedures are important, making sure that we communicate and how we handle it in the moment. And I get it. It's kind of crazy. Sometimes you just got to stop and take a breath and say, okay, let me gather myself here. All right, let's get a plan of action. How do we do that so that we're not taking that out on other people?
Sure. Again, going back to the beginning of the webinar, talking about the difference of absenteeism versus no-call, no-shows. There's a chaoticness about no-call, no-shows that, again, it creates that ripple effect as we have talked about earlier. I want to point to this second slide on updating your policy. For those that don't even have a policy in place, I think it's really important, maybe even to start here. I think it's a really strong base, and also taking in, of course, in what Brad was saying. But my question for you here is, what are some recommendations our audience can make to improve upon these already existing policies if they already have one in place?
So I'm going to go back to it. And I know I sound like a broken record. You got to communicate it. Sometimes people just don't know the expectations. So solidifying the guidelines, the policies, the rules, the expectations becomes really, really important, and communicating them. And I know I can hear people are like, but I tell people all the time, find different ways to communicate that. Find what are the artifacts. Look around the business, look around the office, look around the operation, and say, okay, how would people know? So first is to communicate that. Second is to think about the stories and the words that we use when we're communicating that. How are we communicating that? So not only what we communicate matters, but how we communicate matters, because it sets the tone for how the message is going to be received. If that message sounds punitive, if that message sounds like punishment, it's probably not going to land as well as if that message sounds collaborative or participatory or around creating an environment of team. Those are different kinds of words. And I think we need to be mindful of how we're communicating and delivering those messages. And then the other would be to involve others when possible. I would encourage you to involve other people in decision-making processes where that's appropriate to do so. And that's not appropriate in all of the decisions that we need to make or in all of the things, but perhaps around the no-call, no-show policy, maybe it is. Asking folks, all right, how do we reduce this? What are some strategies? What are some things that we can do? And what I find is when we take those strategies and we implement those strategies from somebody else's idea, there's a little bit of buy-in that comes along with that. And with a little bit of buy-in comes a sense of purpose. And with a little bit of buy-in comes a sense of stability and belonging and a sense of connectedness. And so those would be kind of three areas that I would recommend.
do you recommend any communication practices or, any small little tweaks that a manager can make on their day-to-day to help communicate these policies more clearly to their staff, or even just connect with them on a more human level?
Yeah, I mean, so setting the expectations up front, right? Somebody's
Mhm.
onboarded. I think, we can talk about that then. We can continue to reinforce that through different messaging, through different signage, through how we how we use no call, no shows or replacement lists and what that looks like. Setting up guidelines, I think, becomes really, really important. Making sure that people understand the policy. Maybe it's like, hey, does anybody have a question about the new no call, no show policy that we've implemented today? Or let me tell you kind of why we're doing this, if this is a new thing for you. I think it's important to also enforce that policy consistently, because when we are inconsistent, what we're saying is that it's unimportant.
Mm.
And because of the havoc that it can wreak, I mean, just the total chaos that a no call, no show can wreak in some industries, I think making sure that we're very consistent about how we apply that policy becomes really important. I would also encourage you to address the core problem by improving the scheduling process. Maybe there is an opportunity here and some room for improvement to take a step back,
Mhm.
take a look at it, and see if there's opportunities for us to get better at that. I would also, and I'm going to go back to this, is getting to know your employees
Yeah.
and listening and connecting with them, because I think that stuff really matters in the long run. I do think that when managers and leaders get to know their employees, that it can help reduce no call, no shows.
I think it was Brene Brown who said
Mm,
this. And she said the most disrespectful thing a manager can do is actually be unclear to their
yeah,
staff.
yeah,
I think we underestimate the power of reiteration. I think we underestimate repeating ourselves. And I know, we're talking about, guys, it's all about communication. It's all about, but this is us repeating ourselves.
yeah.
So you can also repeat your own policies to your frontline
Well,
managers, your frontline staff, even those in upper management C-suite, if that's applicable. I mean, I think it's one of those things that can't be said enough, because eventually it will get drilled down, it will be instilled, and it's just going to be something that's, oh yeah, I don't need to be reprimanded again because obviously I know this as a frontline employee.
yeah, I was looking over my shoulder here because I've got Brene Brown's book on my
No
bookshelf
way.
right here. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So great.
And what you're exactly right. Brene talks about clear as kind, and I
Yeah.
use that as a kind of a north star for myself. Like, am I being clear? And she talks about in her book that paint a picture for like what's acceptable here. Like, help me understand what the boundaries are here,
Sure.
and that when we're clear, we're kind. When we're unclear, it's kind of chaotic. And so
Yeah.
I would think it becomes really, really important for us to be clear in our communication. Yeah, yeah. And that's the kindest thing we can do, right?
Totally. Yeah. I would love, Terry asked a great question. What is the
Yeah.
name of the Brene Brown book that you were referring to?
It's called Dare to Lead.
Dare
Dare
to
to Lead.
Lead.
Yeah, I
Awesome.
can't I
I'll
can't
drop
recommend.
I'll drop a link in the chat for everybody. Before I do that, I want to go into the prevention efforts a little bit on no call, no shows. So, Brad, what is the key to disrupt this vicious cycle of no call, no
Yeah.
shows?
So we have talked a lot about communication. So I'm going to talk about a different form of communication. I think having a schedule where everybody can easily see their shifts and know what's going on can eliminate confusion. This can take a bunch of different forms, but this is a form of how we're communicating. It could be a paper sheet. I remember when I worked in the grocery store industry, as a 16-year-old, like, there was a paper copy of my shift. I would check my shift. I knew what that looked like. Times have changed. We have phones now and smart devices that can help us see schedules and scheduling gaps.
Mhm.
I think that's important. I also think reminding folks about upcoming shifts ahead of time when that's feasible can be a tool to prevent no call, no shows. Look, you can do this by emailing, you can use a workforce management software, you can push notifications,
Mhm.
there's all kinds of different ways to do this now that's actually automated that can help you reduce. And as a result of that, increase productivity, increase morale, team building, all that kind of good stuff becomes really important. Yeah.
Definitely.
I also, one other tip would be to make sure that any open shifts are visible to people. Like, where are the gaps? Like, how do we help fill those gaps? And 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 in filling those gaps, like, is the schedule working for everybody? And where is it not working? And how do we support each other back to that currency of flexibility becomes a piece of the puzzle as well. And can I give one last one?
Please.
A dynamic on-call list that incentivizes, not punishes. This goes back to my roots in behavioral economics and using some of the principles of behavioral economics like loss aversion or choice architecture,
Mm.
where it can feel twice as painful to lose something than it is to gain something. And I think that's an important principle that we can put in play here. Is an incentive list or a dynamic on-call list that incentivizes folks but doesn't punish. And there's all different kinds of ways to apply that. And same thing for choice architecture and using scheduling software or scheduling principles that help architect the right spaces and choices based on everybody's preferences or
Sure.
schedule or needs or priorities in their life.
Again, and I love the idea of sending those push notifications and emails. As you know, Brandy says they also get an email on Mondays of their week schedule. I think just consistently communicating with them, and that's exactly what we do here at Workforce, is we're constantly sending those notifications. We're making sure that people are aware. They could even, in terms of flexibility, going back to that, they can swap their own shifts within their own team. It's all, I think, about autonomy and making sure that they're empowered to have that control over their schedule in terms of, okay, I know when I'm coming in this week, I know it's going to be at this time and I'm going to be on this, working the cash register, whatever it might be. And I think it's just so important to consistently communicate it and beat the dead horse a little bit. I hate to say it, but like constantly just being like, hey, we're drilling it in. Like, you are coming in, we're relying on you.
Yeah, that sense of predictability, I think, is really helpful for people. It's certainly helpful for me in my life. And when I'm able to predict it, there's a sense of safety that comes along with that in a variety of areas of my life, right? Whereas no call, no show, we talked about kind of creating a chaotic environment. That sense of stability, that sense of safety becomes a really kind of embedded component of the fabric, the culture of the workforce.
Awesome. I would love for you to talk about some of the metrics that you might look for when it comes to an employee most likely to not show up to work or even to become unengaged in the future.
Yeah, so I would give you four metrics, I think, that are gonna be maybe a little bit different from what some of the words that you have here. So the first is this idea of isolation. Are there people that are just disconnected? They're just they're just not a part of, and you've seen that shift happen. So when people feel isolated, they're less likely to um, I think they're less likely to be as engaged as those who feel connected. So I think it's really, really important to pay attention to those who may be a little bit disconnected and isolated. The second is stress. And sometimes stress can be work induced and sometimes it can be life induced. Maybe there are situations that I've got in my life that are just really, really stressful. And both of these things connect back to this idea of well being. And so that's a third metric that I would encourage you to take a look at. It's certainly an area that we've begun to investigate, and we've looked at things like call centers and frontline team members. This idea of well-being becomes a really critical metric for us to take a look at. And then fourth would be collaboration. What we know from the research is that the science behind collaboration is that when people are collaborating and connected together, they're more likely to have team cohesion that is driving performance. And that's going to reduce no call, no shows. And so those would be four metrics that I think are really important: isolation, stress, well-being, and collaboration. And all four of those directly connect to the idea of employee engagement.
And again, it really does come back down to communication. We're going to keep communicating this theme of communication as many times, but it does really all stem from those. And it's hard to measure the aspect of what you're getting out of communicating, especially one-on-one with your staff. But if you can have consistent communication, you'll be able to measure just simply by knowing what their answers are and being a good listener. So I think that's a really great point. Awesome.
Totally. I agree.
Yeah. So can you give us an example, of how these metrics might be used as a manager, or, how can we even begin to measure these metrics, and how often should they be reviewed?
Yeah, so I love this question about measurement. Let's take the idea of engagement, for example. Engagement is not something that we can go buy. Like, it's not on Amazon Prime Day. I can't go get more of it at Costco. I can't get it delivered in my mail. So it's not a physical thing that we have, but it operates in these other things: isolation, collaboration, stress, well-being, operate much like the same principles of the wind. So sometimes we can't see the wind, right? Like, I can't see it physically moving outside, but I can see the trees rustle. So there are indicators of this, right? Like, I can see the leaves moving, and if the trees are really bent over, man, the wind must be blowing really hard. Or I can see the leaves rustling around on the ground. So there are these indicators of if the wind is blowing and how hard it might be blowing and what direction it's going. Same thing for things like engagement, stress, and isolation. We can't always see someone stressed. Like, they don't carry it around like a physical thing. And the bigger their thing gets, the more stressed out they are. But there are indicators for us as managers and leaders that we could pay attention to. And I think that becomes an important part of the equation around getting to know your team, listening, being observant, understanding what's going on within the situation. How a manager uses these is, for example, if I knew that someone was just kind of, over the last couple of days, they've just been a little disconnected. And I know my team well enough to know that, gosh, Brad looks like he's having a tough day. I might pull him aside and be like, hey, just checking in. How you doing? How's things going? Schedule good? Yeah. Okay. Is there anything I can do for you? And here's the thing about this. The first thing, I'm not saying you need to get personal with all your employees. That's not the suggestion here. The suggestion is to get to know your team in a way that's appropriate for you and for the guidelines of your work. But the second thing that I think is important here is, just because I asked the question doesn't mean somebody has to respond. But the fact that I asked the question is the important component, right? I've extended an umbrella. Look, if you want to stand in the rain, that's okay. Maybe you're not ready to talk to me. Maybe you're not ready to come in under my umbrella right now. That's fine. You want to do that. That's okay. But the fact that I extended it may be enough to spur that conversation later on. And I think that's important. So if I see someone who looks disconnected, or looks a little stressed, or they look like they're just disengaged, and that can look like maybe they're making a lot of errors. Maybe they're no call, no showing a whole lot. Maybe they're brisk with their team, or they're kind of have some crosswords or something with somebody that's not normally like them. That's a good indication for me. Like, okay, perhaps I need to intervene here, and how I deliver that message is just as important as the message that I deliver. And that's a critical piece of managing and leading in this particular workforce.
Sure. Oh, that's awesome. I would love to close out our Q&A and then go into our audience Q&A. But my last question for you, Brad, is what are 1 or 2 top tips, actions, or takeaways you could share with the audience in better reducing their no-call, no-shows of hourly workforce?
Yeah, so I'll give 2 quick takeaways. The first is to shift your perspective. I would look at this as an opportunity to improve your system and refine your policies, and in a way that creates a magnet culture that draws people in. So I would really flip the script on this and look at this as an opportunity for me to improve my operational efficiency. The second thing is when we're communicating, that we're making sure information is flowing in both directions. So this isn't a one-directional thing, so that employees are talking to managers and managers are talking to employees, and vice versa, and that those lanes aren't clogged, but rather, back to the Brene Brown reference, that it's clear, so that we can be as clear as possible, so that that's received as kind. And as a result of that, I think we can reduce no-call, no-shows.
That's great. And for those that were wondering about the book, I did link it in the chat box for those who are interested in buying it. And I would love to go into the Q&A section. We have a ton of amazing, amazing questions, guys. Thank you so much for putting those in. First and foremost, let's start at the very top. Robert asks, what if someone is a no-call, no-show and then arrives for their next scheduled shift and brings in a doctor's note, but it's repetitive, extended weekends in parentheses?
Yeah, so this is a tricky situation because it involves some HIPAA and some medical stuff here. I would defer back to your policy. I would. And I would defer back and consult with your HR team and your legal team to make sure that you are both applying that policy appropriately, and where you can extend compassion. It doesn't cost anything to be compassionate. It doesn't cost anything to know that someone could be telling a different story than what I'm telling about them. And I would encourage those two things. I would consult, I would talk with my legal, my HR team, my ops team, and then where it's possible and where it's appropriate for me to do so, to extend grace and compassion. I think those are things that we can give away for free. They cost us absolutely nothing.
Great points. Jennifer Thompson asks, ideas for how to implement flexibility in the retail space.
Yeah, great question. I think variable shifts, thinking about how you're using software to help manage that. But maybe a really easy tip would be to talk with your team and see what they say. What ideas do they have around that? And a recommendation I would make would not be like, all right, get everybody in the room and be like, all right, what are your ideas for implementing flexibility in the schedule? But rather, I'd see the idea ahead of time. And I might pull 2 or 3 people aside and be like, hey, I'm kind of thinking about this. I'm wondering if you have any ideas. It's okay if you don't have any right now, but do you think you could come back to me in a couple of weeks with maybe some ideas you have around flexible scheduling and how we might implement this? I think it's important also to talk about replacements here as well. Like, all right, what do we do when someone no call, no shows?
Yep.
When we do have a flexible schedule. But I would encourage any manager, any leader out there to involve their team and their workforce as much as possible. I am amazed at how many times I've seen policies implemented, and we've never asked the people that it's going to directly impact. And as a result of that, people are like, hey, what's going on here? I don't understand. I would really, really encourage you to, where possible, to overextend into involving your team into creating policies that are going to impact their day-to-day work.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. And even involving your team, there's that aspect again of company culture that comes into play, where we're all in this together. Like you guys help build this policy, so we all got to uphold it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Michelle Brown asked, we are a home health agency. We send employees through orientation and they don't even show up for their first shift. We tried to contact, but are not successful and have turned to just hiring. Any advice on this?
Yeah, so this is a tough one, and I've heard this a lot, actually, where we go through the whole recruitment process, somebody doesn't even show up for their very first shift. I would think about how I incentivize that over the first 4 weeks, the first 6 weeks, the first 3 months, whatever that might look like, to reduce that from happening. I suspect that right now, if somebody goes through training or onboarding recruitment and they don't show up for their first shift, there's just nothing that happens. And so I would wonder how we not punish that, but how we incentivize and use things like behavioral economics to kind of drive policies and procedures that can support somebody getting into their first day, somebody getting past their first week, somebody getting to their 3 months, their 6 month, their 1 year mark, and what that might look like.
That's great. Jennifer Espen-Sheed, I believe I pronounced that last name right. I'm sorry. My last name's Gershenson, so I introduce myself and people say bless you, so I get it. She asked, can you elaborate what you mean by dynamic on-call list? And that's a great question.
It's great. So sometimes when I think about on-call lists, these things tend to be pretty static, right? and they tend to be kind of one-dimensional. For example, I've worked in shifts before where I've been on call, and there is no contingency, and there's no a dynamic interplay between like the situation, the person, and the need. And so I would think about how we create, and it's easier to do this when you're using software that can help manage this process, that's using machine learning and artificial intelligence to make predictions for you. So I'm thinking about like, if I know, or let's say my software system knows that Brad Shuck typically is a no call, no show on Tuesdays at the noon shift, then that software will no longer put me in. And so I know that I also can't be on call then either. So the dynamic system, the interplay with each other, really is about how the system uses information to learn from behavioral patterns from your employee teams. And so when I say dynamic, I mean, it isn't something that's set in stone. It's not something that is, a hard and fast rule, but rather has a sense of flexibility to it as well.
Definitely. That feeds perfectly into Ravindra's question. Any recommendations for scheduling software that is good for a large workforce? Workforce.com. I'm telling you, it's everything we have to offer. We do machine learning. We do all of it. Notification, surveying. We have a whole slew of products that essentially touched on exactly what we're talking about here. So I highly recommend checking it out. Workforce.com. Go to the website. I'm sure you'll find exactly what you're looking for, I hope. Alyssa Monson asked, what about companies that have set weekly schedules /shifts? What advice do you have there?
Yeah. So I think it's important to say that no one solution is going to fit for everybody. But rather, if that is the parameters of the work that you're doing, then I would go back to my employees and say, hey, is there anything we could be doing differently? And I think sometimes when I say like integration and flexibility, there's like this, at least in my mind, I visualize like ultimate freedom and like I can just come and go as I want. Like that's not what I'm saying.
Right.
I'm saying, where is there an opportunity to introduce a little flexibility within the schedule, or a little bit of integration within that schedule, or a little bit of a dynamic scheduling system, rather than we have to go all in or all out. And I think if this is something that's new, I'd bring it up and talk about it. Hey, what do you think about this? I've got this idea. Again, going back to communicate and involving those that are involved in the work, because these policies are going to impact them. But I think it's important again to say not all solutions are going to be a one size fits all for all industries.
Definitely. Niche Manier asks, is there any research on improving no call, no shows within employees with disabilities?
So I think the question here is there research around how we reduce no call, no shows with employees with disabilities? In my experience, I don't know of any of that work. And if that is of particular concern for your workforce, we work a lot with different types of vulnerable populations. Those who have been traditionally marginalized, those who have economic and home instability, they're food insecure. Maybe they've just gotten out of the prison pipeline. Each of those unique employee populations has a unique set of needs. And so getting to know your workforce becomes essential in those circumstances. So I would encourage you to think about and even like dive into any resources that you might find. But I don't know of any research off the top of my head that specifically looked at employees who also live with a disability and who may be frequent no call, no shows.
That's a great point. We do have a couple more questions, and you guys are so awesome, but I don't want to take up any more of Brad's time. So we're going to get to one more. And if you have any questions, be sure to email myself. Sean did ask in the chat if you offer one-on-one coaching, Brad. So if you want to throw in your information in the chat, feel free. But we're going to get to one more question from Taylor Wallerstein. She asked, we currently have an NCNS policy in our handbook, which every team member signs. That's awesome. How do you continue to reinforce this without focusing on the negative early on?
So it's a good question. And it is so oftentimes about how we frame that conversation. And I'm reminded of we've got these book references today, Meredith, of a Stephen Covey principle that I use a lot. And that is to seek first to understand before being understood. And the need to sharpen the saw. So let me elaborate on that quickly. So sometimes when I'm approaching what I might consider to be a difficult conversation with an employee, rather than trying to get my point across first, like, hey, look, I need you to understand how you're impacting the team here. Mm-hmm. Instead of trying to be understood first, I always try. I try. I don't always get this right, by the way. I try to seek to understand and then be understood. And when I've approached a situation like that, it flips the script because nobody's expecting that. So it becomes a transformational conversation versus a transactional conversation, if that makes sense. And then I think for managers and for leaders today, look, folks are busy. Like, you're really, really busy. Like, you've got a lot of stuff. And when you've got a no call, no show, or a critical situation or something that's just kind of chaotic, it's normal in the moment to like kind of get angry about it or kind of like let my emotions show or get kind of heated about it in the moment. And that's why I say it's really, really important to sharpen your saw. And what I mean by that is that I bet for the great majority of people that are on this webinar today, they're tired. They're exhausted. They've got so much that they're handling that's coming at them right from left. You have to build time in for self-care, and you have to build time in for your own professional development. It's okay to prioritize those things, because when you're prioritizing those things, you're able to give your best self to your team. And I think that becomes really, really important.
That's awesome. That is so great. And trust me, we can go on a whole nother tangent on the importance of a good morning routine to make sure you're set up for success. Absolutely. I mean, that's like a whole, we actually delved into it a little bit in a previous webinar. I think it was the how to prevent call outs during the holiday season. For those who do want to check it out, we went through a whole tangent on morning routines and making sure you're set up for success. But regardless, I digress. Brad, thank you so much for coming on. I do want to quickly hand out our 5 tips to reduce employee no-call, no-shows. It really sums up some of the points that we elaborated here. I